Please be advised that in order to foster quality discussions in each episode, we will spoil the stories in each game and text we talk about. Good news is, 90% of the titles we cover are old enough that many of you might already know all about them. That said, we do encourage you to play and read before listening.
Listen up now, when you leave on, get ready for arcade bookshop. With your ball, and play a game, check it out. Okay man, listen up now, when you leave on, get ready for arcade bookshop.
Welcome to Arcade Bookshop, your podcast about video games and the books they remind us of for all of you who love to play and to read. Thanks so much for listening and joining us today. I'm Bryce Yoli, and as always, I'm here with my pal and cousin-in-law, Caleb James. And returning to the show today is our friend, author Nicolas Obregon. Thanks for coming back.
Gentlemen, good to be back.
Today we're talking about a game that I think many people it seems they've already deemed it a classic. It's been remastered, it's been remade for modern consoles. There's a sequel, from forever ago, and it's even been turned into a TV show. We're talking about the 2013 PlayStation 3 post-apocalyptic video game, The Last of Us.
Yeah.
Spooky, awesome atmospheric music in the background. The Last of Us follows a man named Joel who loses his teenage daughter at the beginning of a zombie outbreak caused by a mutation of a fungus, the cordyceps fungus, which usually affects insects but mutated to attack and degrade human beings. 20 years after the initial outbreak, these spores continue to persist in a post-apocalyptic world where the population has been obliterated by disease. Government has fallen apart, and a variety of... Oh, we lost Nick. Well, just to continue the synopsis, and a variety of small factions try to reorganize the chaos. We mostly play as... There he is.
I was on the bottom.
I don't know what happened there. My
I don't
bad.
know. That's okay. All right. Rewind. So,
He said, "Fuck you guys." Click.
So, continuing the synopsis. 20 years after the initial outbreak, these spores continue to persist in a post-apocalyptic world where the population has been obliterated by disease, governments fallen apart, and a variety of small factions try to reorganize the chaos. We mostly play as Joel, who is tasked with transporting a teenage girl named Ellie to one of these groups called the Fireflies to investigate why Ellie is immune to the spores and whether she's the key to manufacturing a cure. So, Nick, how we usually start it off is we do like a preliminary initial thoughts about the game, and then we'll dive into digging deep into the characters and the story. So, I'll just start. I really like this game, and I like the story. And I love Naughty Dog games in general. I think they're some of my favorite modern games. And I love stealth games, so it scratched a lot of itches for me. Finally playing this in 2024. But I also I never got around to watching the show, so I don't have that in mind for this. So my perspective is strictly the story in the game, but you can feel free to add stuff about the TV show as we talk. And just to be clear for everybody listening, we're only talking about the first game. So I know nothing about The Last of Us 2, so I don't have anything to say about that today.
Are there only 2 games?
Yeah, there's 2.
Well, there's
and
some download. There's some DLCs as well, but
Yeah.
the 2 main games, yeah.
So what do you guys have to say?
Loved it.
Caleb didn't play the game, so just to be clear. But
so the TV show, just to get that out of the way, I would say they did a bunch of new kind of interesting stuff with it, but I would say 80% of that is beat for beat the same thing as the game, which is interesting in itself, right? If you don't need to fucking change the original thing, right? You just put Pedro Pascal and just shoot him with a camera and just make him do the same stuff for 80% of it. then I think that's probably testament to the work of the original story. Like for me, I played it when it came out. Didn't know anything about it going in, other than that it was kind of dystopian, and it had a kind of like end of the world type outbreaky feel, which I'm all in on that. But went in with kind of low expectations, other than the fact it was I liked the Uncharted games and they felt very cinematic, so I thought this is an interesting kind of crossover for me. And then like within the first 15 minutes, it was like, okay, Naughty Dog have actually done it, right? This idea that like, we've had before lots of games for a long time have tried to feel like a movie. Um, I don't know, like I'm thinking like Heavy Rain or the Metal Gear series, LA Noir, like a bunch of them have like tried to do it. But in those first few kind of like 5, 10, 15 minutes of The Last of Us, I clearly remember thinking, this is it. They've done it. This feels like a movie.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, I think, and I'm gonna like roll naturally right into our actual conversation here. I think it's one of the first games that had like very, very natural, literally cinematic movie like voice
Mm.
acting.
Oh,
Now I'm sure there were plenty of others that were pretty good, but I never had any moment during this game where I was like, ugh, it's like one of those
right,
weird they're probably Japanese, but they're talking like Americans.
right, right.
I never had any of
Y-
that. It was so like legit the whole way through.
mm.
And
Yeah,
it
like
was
so natural, like it
yes.
really kind of, I mean, for anybody who hasn't played it or hasn't seen the series, which is probably not many, but the yeah, there's a great story, right? And yeah, the I think it looks gorgeous. The sound is fucking incredible. Like the soundtrack is amazing. So like there's a good game there, right? But I don't think it's necessarily the game itself which makes it a
Mm,
masterpiece. It's
I'd
it's
agree.
it's the story that runs through, and the story that runs through it is this two-hander between Joel and Ellie. This kind of grizzled, kind of apathetic, cold man who's lost his daughter 20 years ago, and so who's decided to put a wall up, right? And she, bit by bit, chips away at that wall, um, at his kind of pain, right? So
Hmm.
the very fact they have to have a relationship terrifies him, right? Um, that central dynamic is what makes this a masterpiece. And like you say, the only reason it works is because the two voice actors fucking knock it out the park. They feel real, and that is the core element of suspension of disbelief, right? Like we know
Right.
zombies and all of that. We know this could be schlock. It really could be a
Mm,
schlocky, silly zombie story, right? And yet you just buy it and you just go with it. And I think a large part of that is that relationship, which is just sublime.
Agreed. And before I want to talk a lot more about that because that is the
Mm,
central part of the story. Uh, before we go too far, um, what do you think about? Well, I guess I'll just say my opinion. Like, I didn't play this back when it came out,
mm,
and everyone was telling me to play it. I remember a specific kid being like, "You gotta play The Last of Us. I've played it twice already. Like, you gotta go through it." And I was like, "I don't feel like playing another zombie game. Like, I've played the
yeah,
Resident Evil games, and I've been watching The Walking Dead, and The Walking Dead is my biggest point here because
right.
The Walking Dead was still like one of the biggest shows on TV, besides like Mad Men probably,
Mm,
at the time this came out. So I was like, why would I want to play another zombie game
right.
when The Walking Dead is out? And like to add on to that, it's not just that they're both zombie stories, it's that they're both zombie stories where the focus is not the zombies. They're
Right.
they're both kind of the same thing, like, "Oh, we're in this post-apocalyptic world, and there's zombies everywhere, and they're trying to kill us all, and we're turning into them." But that's not really the worst of it. The worst of it is that we're defending ourselves from other people who aren't zombies, like, we're
Right.
still fighting each other as human beings and, experiencing, like, human conflict still. So I guess then I'll flip it back to you. Like, what do you think makes it makes it still like a worthwhile thing amidst at the
Mm,
time anyway, amidst all like The Walking Dead and other things that are actual quality uh
right.
things doing the same moving with the same idea.
Right. I mean, so with The Walking Dead, I mean, I tapped out of that maybe season 2. So it's not like I never read any of the graphic novels and stuff. So it's not like I'm mega qualified to talk about like that parallel. But what I would say is I've seen a lot online, people saying that the new Walking Dead stuff is now ripping off The Last of Us, which is just wild because that just becomes sort of meta by that point, you know. Um, I do think there are kind of parallels between the two kind of themes, right? Which is like the true horror is not the zombie, because you know where you stand with the zombie, right? The true horror is man. That's not for me like necessarily a Walking Dead or a Last of Us thing. That's basically all dystopian stories, right? That's like, you know, anything where there are zombies or any kind of dystopian story. The worst is like what we become ourselves in order to survive, right? So um and I could see for sure on the surface or from the outside how you might assume that they're doing a similar thing. For me, I think the reason why I tapped out of The Walking Dead, versus why I was just all in on The Last of Us, I think the difference is the characters. And this is not to like come after like Walking Dead fans, so I apologize in advance, but I think it's bad, and I think it's bad because
Hmm.
I do not give a shit about any one single character in that whatsoever. And the moment that the guy who's fucking the other guy's wife, right, and awkward because now he's back and blah blah, the minute that plot line ends, I'm out of it, right? And I think that what makes us connect with characters, right, is number one, they have to feel like there's flesh on the bones. They have to feel like that guy really exists, right? That guy, really does have these traits. But number two, the drivers behind them are important, right? Jealousy, loving someone who's with someone else, right? That's a primary driver, right? Like I can get behind that. Once we get into like this guy runs this town and he's a tyrant and you know, and I think what The Last of Us does so well within the shell of kind of dystopia and zombies and the rest of it, it never ever gets far away from the headline ticket, which is, Joel and Ellie love each other, and
Mm.
they will do anything in order to survive. Which, not to get to the ending, right? Which is why I think the ending is so interesting, because it's directly, getting into it's saying, where were we going with this, right?
Hmm.
So to recap all of that, I think for me, I think the big difference is, yeah, on paper there's, you know action films are action films, right? Or zombie stories are zombie stories. But I think for me, the difference with The Last of Us is the quality of the character work, the quality of the interplay between the characters, from the two central guys right down to like peripheral people. Like you take someone like Tess, or you take someone like Bill. They're not doing much in the story. They're not in it for long, but they absolutely have their own characters. They absolutely have their own backgrounds. Like we'll probably get into that. But just one example: early on in the game, there's a bit where Joel doesn't want to. Joel is clearly reticent to take on the quest. He doesn't want to be saddled with the young girl, and she looks at him and she says, "I get it." Right? Now, we know as the player, because we were there in the prologue, that he's lost his
Hmm.
child 20 years ago. And so when
Right.
she says, "I get it," 20 years later, in those three words, we can infer an entire relationship between them. And they kind of allude to it here and there, right? But that's the quality I'm talking about. It's what's so great about The Last of Us is sometimes it's doing the simple stuff so well, that it allows for, you don't have 1,000 characters in it. You don't have to keep track of all the pieces and stuff. So yeah, man, I think you can see they exist in a similar universe, but I just think The Last of Us is just such a more elegant and poignant look at this type of world for me.
Yeah, and I think it ultimately is more captivating because it doesn't go overboard with characters too. There are too many characters in The Walking Dead, and there's
Right.
too many where it's like, oh, what side are and like the audience, like, who do you like most? What side are you on with this? And it's like,
Right.
well, like shrink it down a little bit. I mean,
Yeah.
I get it's supposed to be like real life, and there might be that many people, but I think in terms of storytelling, it's just like overload. So what I like, what I think thought of while you were saying like the simplicity and like the just those 3 words, I get it. Uh, it reminds me of like how when you're just playing the game,
Mm,
you're exploring new environments, and like picking stuff up off shelves and junk, and there's no threat around. That's when Ellie starts piping up, and she's just like
right,
asking questions about like Joel's past, or like like asking questions about the past in general, because
right.
Ellie has only lived in this world,
Yeah,
and she's like finding things, and she's like, "What? I wish I could have, I wish I could have played this old arcade game."
right,
And then you go through like the fantasy of her like
right.
imagining what it's actually like. Uh, yeah, simple
It's so
things like that.
beautiful. Like,
It's
well, there's
yeah.
a bit when they go into the hotel, and
Mhm.
you're in this like abandoned, destroyed hotel, and there are these cannibals trying to catch you, right? But it's a quiet moment in the game, and as you walk into the hotel, you're trying to find the way through to the next part, and Ellie's in the background pretending to check in, and pretending to ask for a room and stuff like that. It's just those little details, man. That's where The Last of Us is so good because it makes it feel so human, right? And like you say, it's a young girl who is trying to learn her way in the world, but she's paired up with an older guy who's gone the other way. He's already been in the world and he's close to it. And so that real interplay between them, right, where she kind of bounces off of him, and bit by bit you see his kind of barriers kind of come down.
Yeah.
It's that's the really good stuff.
Yeah, I agree. See, I think the way it's shrunken like that does make it just superior in that way.
Mm,
Um, at the same time, I feel like it took me a bit to feel that way.
mm,
I think initially finishing the game, I was like, "Nah, it wasn't as good as I thought it was gonna be." I guess I
right,
felt like I was waiting for, because it's been so hyped up and I had no idea what it was about really. I was like waiting for some like insane, like awesome storytelling point that turns it on its head, and it never really happened necessarily. I think it's just like super well done classic storytelling
right,
that is fantastic for people who do appreciate that already. And
right,
it's also extra fantastic for people who mostly just play video games and don't typically experience really great
right,
storytelling.
right.
So yeah, I think it took me a bit to really understand like all the nuances that make it as good as people think it is. And it's not just like, I don't know what I'm trying to think of, like pulp, uh, really great, just wild, like it's
Right.
just good storytelling.
Well, it's interesting because I think one of well, not criticisms, but one of the things that people have often pointed out about The Last of Us is how, like, you have the game on one hand and the act of playing the game on one hand versus when you have the cutscenes and when the story is happening. And those are like two different trains on two different tracks. And I don't think it's that the gameplay is on any level bad. I happen to really enjoy it. It's very sort of it's very chunky and sort of effective. The combat feels really kind of like brutal. The sound is doing a lot. It's got like a real kind of like tactile feel to it, but it's not
Mhm.
reinventing the wheel, right? It's
No.
not, it's like Uncharted in some elements, but like with brain splatter and stuff, right? Um, I think it's just that because the story is so elegantly done, that it kind of goes to a high bar that the gameplay can't quite get to. You know what I mean? So it's like it kind of the story is that good that I think the gameplay kind of suffers in comparison, right? Um, and I think another probably, I mean, I'm guessing, but I would imagine what was affecting your experience is if you come to it in 2013 with zero expectations, right? It kind of blows you away. But it's like if you try and explain to like a girlfriend, um, oh, you've never seen Star Wars. Let's sit down and watch Star Wars, right? And then you sit down and you watch, A New Hope, and she's just like, "This is dog shit. Like, this is just stupid, right? Like, they're little like floppy puppets and stuff." And if you don't have that kind of childhood
Yeah.
with Star Wars, it's really difficult in the cold light of data. So I don't think The Last of Us is like anywhere like that, but I do think by this point it has, because it is a sort of contemporary classic. PlayStation, Sony does use the image of Ellie in a lot of their like marketing stuff now
Yeah.
because she's become one of those kind of like iconic characters in the world of video games. it has reached the sort of with the HBO series and blah blah blah. It's reached the kind of level that I think is difficult to actually pay off for a new sort of gamer to come in tomorrow, and experience it for the first time. You go in 2013 on PlayStation 3, right, with like zero expectations, and you're like, this is better than anything I've played this year. This is also better than anything I've seen in the movie theater this year as well. So it's like it really did pop in that way, which I think probably now it doesn't.
Yeah, agreed. Like something I've been saying to Caleb constantly is like I bought a PlayStation 5 back in the winter, and
Mm.
I feel like I've only played the only PlayStation 5 game that I've played is Modern Warfare 3, which is like horseshit.
Right, right, right,
So
right,
like then I keep popping in these games for the podcast because they have good stories, but they're older games. So
right.
I'm constantly playing things that like they look fine, but they're not PlayStation 5 games. So uh yeah, they have that, like you said, like chunkiness, a little like heaviness to them, like
Mm,
gritty. Uh, but I agree though, it's still good, and I like stealth games.
mm,
And the only thing that that did take like took the immersiveness kind of out of it for me was I've played all of the Uncharted games, so
right.
playing this, I recognized not a lot, but there was one thing I recognized that seemed, and I don't know which direction it went, like, if it I think Uncharted came first, right? So,
Yeah,
um, there's a chime that plays, like, when
right,
you're so you probably know what I'm talking about, like, when it's trying to direct you to something, if you can't find where you're supposed to go, it's like, "Ching," and
right.
then it's, it's getting your attention. I think it's straight from Uncharted, is it
I
sounds
think
like
there are
that,
some
like
button prompts as well. Like sometimes when a
yeah.
button prompt comes up on screen, I'm pretty sure that's ripped from Uncharted. Weirdly, in The Last of Us 2, one of the like little Easter eggs. So there's a part of Uncharted 2 where it's kind of like semi like open world for a segment of the game, which is kind of weird. It's like
Oh.
maybe like a 30 or 40. I mean, you could make it maybe a couple of hours if you explore everything, right? But it's like a section of The Last of Us 2 which is kind of semi-open world, and you can do it in any order.
Hmm,
And one of the things is an abandoned bank, and so you go in, and it's full of the infected and clickers and stuff like that, and they're in the bank clothes and whatever. But when you go in there, you see that there was a bank robbery happening on Outbreak Day, right? So like, and
okay.
it just got caught in the middle of this thing. And so you go into the vault, and in the bank vault, one of the kind of safe boxes is Nathan Drake's ring as like an Easter egg,
Oh.
right?
That's
And
cool.
and like, it's funny because like when I first played it years ago now, I was like, oh, I love it, right? That's cool. And then I did a replay on The Last of Us 2 remastered, and this time I was like, I actually don't like that, because it's kind of breaking the reality somehow now. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, so
Yeah.
both of these things are happening in the same. I don't know. Like it was the one thing that kind of took me out of it in a way. So yeah, for sure, you can see some of the mechanisms are straight from Uncharted. Even like there are certain movements that Joel does where it kind of reminds me a lot of Nathan. So,
Mhm.
but thankfully those are great games. So if you are going to pull, it's at least it's from a good game, right?
Right, yeah, and that's fine, like, I don't know if it would bother me that much to find the ring, but I guess I get what you mean, you don't always want like, there's kind of a time and place for Easter eggs, and I don't know if a
Right,
post-apocalyptic world is the place for it, but,
right,
the little, like, chime thing bothered me because it almost doesn't make sense to me because it like, in Uncharted, that sound to me is like a bag of coins or something, like, shaken.
right,
And to hear that in The Last of Us is kind of like, why what is that? Is that supposed to
right.
be am I supposed to think they're, like, chains being pulled or, like
It's weird because I think, I mean, actually, one of the things that I think The Last of Us does really well is its kind of audio scape generally. Like, I
generally, yeah.
remember the kind of the mechanism that I really loved was, so first of all, for anybody who hasn't played it, it is basically a stealth game. There aren't like puzzles and stuff like that. You just have to traverse landscapes, and for the most part, not get found, right? Not get
Right.
seen. And the clickers, which are blind, kind of like bats, but they operate on sound. So they kind of have two modes, which is being completely still, or like going for you. And I think it's just such a beautiful dynamic of being like, shit, I have to get past them without making noise. But then there's other people walking around and stuff. And I just remember the feeling of that tension, right? Of like genuinely being like, this is fucking tense, right? That's so fun. And when you get kind of spotted, or like there's a kind of like growing suspicion, there's this kind of like humming, like, and it grows and grows and grows. And if it grows too much, then they spot you. And then there's like a douche sound, and that's it. Now they spot you, and like the bad guys, the humans, will go, he's over here, blah, blah, blah. And they
Yeah.
like go for you, right? The sound, I think, generally works really, really well. But it's funny because, like you say, when you do game a lot, when you do kind of, especially with like, Naughty Dog games going way back, when you do recognize those kind of like house trademarks, there's something about it which is kind of reminding you this is just a video game and this is what we do, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and I would. It's like if you read a book, there are certain things, let's say Stephen King does, right? Where if you read enough of his books, you're like, oh, he's doing the thing again, right? Or we spoke about Murakami, we were like, oh, so 50-year-old guy who's looking at like the ears of a teenage girl and he's listening to jazz and blah, blah. So obviously, like, people have their trademarks, but in a video game, when you're like, oh, this is an Ubisoft thing again, it's generally not a good sign. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It gets a little, it just pulls you out.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, but um that's where I didn't want to go too far discussing the gameplay, because I agree with what you said earlier. It's like when you're actually thinking about it being a video game, it does kind
Mm.
of diminish it a little bit.
Right.
And that's why it's cool that they were able to turn it into a TV show and like
Right.
literally steal it shot for shot sometimes.
Right.
But I guess just talking about character, something that I was thinking about was how Joel is. I mean, I guess I'll start from the beginning here. I was shocked playing it when the moment that I saw that it said 20 years later.
Right.
How often do you see a zombie story, or read a zombie or watch a zombie story where it's like, oh, the zombie outbreak happened and then flash 20 years later? Like,
Yeah.
Right.
you kind of
Right.
think like, but the world's still around.
Right.
So like, I thought that was fascinating, and then especially when you started really getting into it, um, because it seems natural for like already for Joel to, I guess not already, it's 20 years, but as the player, uh, it feels natural that Joel is reactive to defending himself, you know. So it's
Right.
like you kind of got to think like, wow, like 20 years later, he's still alive. He's starting to look old and gray.
Mm.
This guy has developed a natural uh inclination for killing people, like
Right.
just out of survival, not because
Right.
he wants to, because you
No.
have to.
And I'm really glad you brought that up. I think one of the things that The Last of Us does exceptionally well, I think it thinks a lot about point of view, in a way where a lot of games certainly narratively don't, right? Where is the camera, right? For example, where does the game begin, right? So you mentioned that the outbreak day. We're not in Air Force One. We're not in a fucking presidential bunker. We're in like a suburban home with a teenage girl, right? And there are missed calls going on. There's like a newsreel in the background, and when the thing with the neighbor happens, right,
Hmm.
Joel rushes in. He says, it's the Hendersons next door. Something ain't right with them, and he's getting his gun, and then Henderson throws him against the neighbor throws himself against the glass, and he ends up shooting him. That whole sequence where they're running away and they're in the family car
Hmm.
is tethered to Sarah's point of view in the back, and
Right, right.
you can't do anything, but you can just pan around the car and you can just look at
Uh-huh.
her friends and neighbors, right? Stuff like that. It feels more like the work of an author versus just like, okay, we have to make a video game. There's some bad guys. Go, right? And so that time jump is a narrative choice. It's like an author's choice. He loses his daughter, and the next thing you do is you get the card that says 20 years later. As you say, right off the bat, the fact he's still around has told us,
Yeah.
okay, he's chosen to survive. How did he get this far with the world the way it is? He's a bad person, and he's grizzled, right? And he's tired and he's cold and he doesn't give a shit, right? Like when Tess is saying, "Let's go kill this guy," he's just like, "All right, let's do it." It's just a Tuesday to him, right? So it tells us so much about who he is, and that's why he can do all of these like horrible things and not break a sweat. But when you put him in a room with a teenage girl who's making him be a human being, who's making him be a dad, that terrifies him.
Yeah.
That to me is why The Last of Us is so good, because it's about what's inside Joel, right?
Right.
Not about what's around Joel. And that's where good story happens, I think.
That reminds me a lot of I Am Legend, where it's like old world versus new world, and then you have the
Right,
split, and you have one guy who his way of life is pretty much gone, and he has to adapt to this new world. And then at
right,
what point do you become the bad guy? I don't
right,
know how mindless the zombies and stuff in this game are, but like in I Am Legend, they're vampires. The
right.
movie strays a little bit; they're still vampires, but it turns out they're sentient. They're not just mindless.
Mm,
So it's like, "Oh, no, humans just evolved, and now you're the old thing, and you're the bad thing, and you
right.
need to either die or evolve with us." So I always like stories and appreciate stories that are able to have that kind of element to it where it just seems it's more important than just, "Oh, they're zombies and, they're faceless, nameless zombies, you just kill
Right,
them." Maybe there's a little
right.
more to it than that, and maybe we're actually fighting off the progress, or in this case, it might be a digression or a,
Mm.
de-evolution, but if you're in the majority, which would be the zombies, then you wouldn't want your race or your fungi people to get killed, then
Right,
you
right.
wouldn't wanna be killed. Nobody wants to be killed off. So it's just like a good, contradiction there.
It's funny you mentioned I Am Legend because the book, which then gets its movie adaptation, um, much like obviously The Last of Us did, well, a series. The The Last of Us series is so faithful to the original story, which is obviously a lot more recent. There are a couple of interesting departures, but primarily it's the same thing. The Last of Us movie, with the whole point of the Last of Us book, where spoilers, he at the end when the vampires finally kind of catch him and they're gonna like put him to death and kind of crucify the evil kind of slaughter the white whale at last. When they're bringing him out, he sees the young vampires and he sees and they're terrified of him because he spent his thousands of days just going around finding them in daylight and just killing them, that he realizes he's the vampire and that they're just, as you say, they're just the
Mhm.
next step, right? And I think what's really interesting about that is basically, again, we're talking about POV. Like, so where is the POV here? Am I the hero, or am I just standing in the way of the next step in evolution? And I think The Last of Us does that really well. It takes your expectation, which is I'm Joel, I'm the hero, I'm the good guy, and it constantly toys with it and building up to the ending where we'll probably get to that. But the ending is asking the very question, like, how far is Joel willing to go in order to protect this girl? And is it too far? How many video games are asking philosophical questions in the ending? You know what I mean?
Well, it
Yeah,
almost
and
has the ending almost has a cabin in the woods vibe to it where it's
Right.
like the greater good or your personal feelings. And what that's a huge contrast, and that adds a very deep element because it's easy to say, "Oh no, we do the thing that saves the most people." The old
Mm.
train conductor. It's
Yeah, yeah, the
do we
problem.
save the
Yeah.
5 or the 2 that we know? Well, in this case, it's like it's easy to say, "Oh no, we save everybody and let my daughter die or my wife die," but when you're actually in that situation, it's a lot harder.
Mhm.
and in terms
Right.
of the build up to that, I think there are only a handful of big moments where it makes you start to question that. I mean, and like the other thing I'm thinking of is when you meet, I can't remember their names, but the the
Oh, Henry and Sam.
yeah, Henry and Sam.
Yes, yes.
Um, yeah, you meet them, and then there's a part where you kind of get separated, so it's like
Mm,
it turns into being paired like Ellie and
Henry.
Henry, and then Joel and Sam. So you
Mm,
kind of get a taste of their characters in
mm,
isolation, and the whole time and we can talk about the the next thing with the main antagonist, but you're getting these like little tastes of like questioning what's really going on, who really are
mm.
these people, because you don't know if like did you just meet someone that's a bad guy? Are they gonna like
Right,
take you down a bad path, or are you the bad guy taking them down a bad, like who
It's
right.
always
really,
the POV, yeah.
yeah, who really should be trusted here?
I
And
think as well that the you know when so that point is maybe sort of halfway through the game, and what I really love about one of the things I really love about The Last of Us is it always feels very intentional. Right, you don't just get introduced to these two guys just because they were bored and they needed to chuck in a few extra characters. Right, it's they're very intentionally put there to show the parallel. Right, so they're kind of like the inverse of Joel and Ellie.
right,
Something that they get into quite a bit in the TV series is, yeah, Joel and Ellie basically love each other, right? Like they're basically like a kind of surrogate father and daughter. But one of the things that she loves about Joel is his ability to wield violence, right? Early on, when the soldier is about to kill her, Joel beats him to death. And one of the shots they have in the series is the camera isn't on Joel beating the soldier to death. It's on Ellie, and she looks absolutely transfixed. She's like fascinated by it, right? And so she kind of instinctively realizes that in this world, brutality is a currency. Henry and Sam, on the other hand, who are brothers, he has such a strong moral code. Like he doesn't let the boy take a toy from a toy
yeah,
shop. What was the rule? Well, we don't take anything that we don't need. Even though the
hmm,
toy shop has been abandoned for 20 years, right? And even though
right,
everybody's dead, right? He still says it's bad, in a way where Joel is like, fuck everything, you have to survive. I think it's really interesting the way they do that. When they introduce people, it really does move the needle in terms of the characters of Joel and Ellie. And they're not just kind of drifting through the world and there are these bit part characters. They do kind of affect the story.
That's the classic debate of barbarism versus civil society. So you have what's best, and it's always situational. So in this world,
Right.
obviously, the brutality is what you need to get by. And if you're a moral person and you're trying to do the moral thing, it really doesn't actually have any value because say you don't kill someone and then they turn into one of these things and go after you. What good was it not killing them?
Right.
You did the moral thing, but unless you have certain religious beliefs or something, it really doesn't mean anything. So it's just about
Mm.
survival. And a lot
Right.
of, again, that would only work until everything's rectified. And then if we go back to a civil
Mm.
society, when the one that's partaking in barbarism, you're going to be fucked now. You're going to go to
Right.
jail or be executed or whatever.
Well, and to go with that, um, the decision that Joel makes at the end, where seemingly there is a chance of maybe going back to civilized society, maybe there is a cure, right? And obviously Ellie is that, she would be that Christ-like figure to sacrifice herself in order to have a cure. Joel doesn't want to lose her, and so he chooses barbarism. He chooses status quo. He would rather live in that world of violence in order to keep what's close to him. Those types of kind of choices that are presented in a game, and obviously in the game you kind of play through that sequence. I just find that so much more compelling than just like it's the last level and now you have to fight the big boss, and you know what I mean. So it's not like the gameplay, like I say, is taking you to a level where, like, I don't know, I'm trying to remember, like the first time I played like Ocarina of Time. I remember playing that and just being like, fucking hell, like this is just a fucking masterpiece, and you know it in the moment. It's not like the gameplay is doing that, but it is forcing you into kind of awkward, thought-provoking kind of moral territory. And it's just quite rare to get that on the fucking PlayStation 3
Yeah.
in 2013.
Right. Well, and then to keep this conversation going, we have this moment later on after Joel is hurt horribly bad,
Mm,
and you end up getting the opportunity to play as Ellie for the
right.
first time, I think. Um, she is hunting this deer, and
Mm,
because I mean she's hoping for medicine all the time, but the least she can do is feed him while
mm,
while he has this terrible infection and he's like on the verge of death. So she's getting better at hunting, and she sees this like buck, I guess, and she's like tracking it, and she finally gets it down and finds where it keeled over, and these other people show up,
mm,
and you meet David, who ends up being kind of the main antagonist for the rest of the
mm,
game. And I think that was the point where I was like, ooh, because I could not decide for the life of me how to place him. It's
mm.
very, very convincing. And I put the spoiler thing at the beginning of this episode because
Right.
of right now, where I'm going to say you aren't expecting him. Like you are fully convinced he's a good guy after like the amount of time you spend like fending off zombies and shit with him. It's like, oh,
Mm.
I guess I thought he was going to be bad, but he's actually on my team. And then
So
he's a
you, by the
fucking
way, you know who plays him, who does the voice for him?
I don't.
It's the guy who does the voice of Nathan Drake.
Oh,
Yeah.
really?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Like, I'm pretty sure it's the same guy, but he's putting on that kind of like, you look upset, Ellie. He's got this real kind of. I think that's it. Is that there's something about the quality of the voice where you're like, I don't know if I can trust this guy, right? But then, like you say, you go through this big encounter where you get swarmed by like a horde of zombies, and it's just you and Ellie. You're not Joel anymore, so you're not this big
Yeah.
powerhouse who's killed all of these fucking bad guys. You're like a little girl, and you've got a little shitty bow and arrow. It's a really exciting part of the game where you have to go through this kind of factory which is overrun,
Yeah.
and you do kind of, and he does help you. So when there's that reveal, you're like, "Fuck, I knew." You know what I mean? It's so well done. I think.
Yeah, you find out, just to lay it all on the table, you find out that well, a little bit earlier in the game, you're like fending off this group of people that are I think they tell you they're cannibals, and you're
Mm,
like, oh, I've got them taken care of. I'm gonna move on. You forget about them, and then all of a sudden,
yeah.
here's their leader, and here's
Yeah.
where they're
Right.
from,
Right.
and all of a sudden you find Ellie is put in a cage, and she's being like interrogated to find out where Joel is,
Mm,
and man, and then when you finally, I don't want to give all the details, I guess, but when she finally like gets out, and then you start traversing like
mm,
the inner workings of what they've established, it's
mm.
like holy shit. Like it's like
Yeah.
unfathomable that humanity could come to that, and then still retain the awareness of like how to pretend to be civil and human. And
Right.
Can you be a good person in that world though? Like, is there a
Well,
way
I
that you
think,
could
but
be
see,
as
but see, that's the question, isn't it? That's the question, and I think that's what The Last of Us is basically asking, right? Is
mhm,
is in this world, who are you, right? Who are you going to be when all bets are off? And I think that's part of the kind of dynamic between Joel and Ellie is they are trying to decide, are we good or are we not good, right? And okay, we have love, we love each other, right? Is that always a good thing? What if you love someone so much you end up fucking slaughtering thousands of people for it? Is that good? Those are the questions, man, that this game is getting into. Yeah, and
yeah,
that part of the game you're talking about where you escape and they're hunting you, and you're like, you find these like meat ledgers where they're talking
yeah,
about how many pounds of flesh and stuff like that. You're just like, you know, that horror and the final kind of showdown with David, where it's just Ellie kind of facing up to her fear, and she deals with it by herself, right? Like, so, and really, the first time I was playing it, really tense, man. I know you're out there, Ellie, and all of this. And you're just like, shit, man.
I think that's why this game is such a good companion to Cormac McCarthy's The Road, because like
Yes,
one of the big themes in that is, are we the good guys? So what the kid
yes.
always asks the dad, are we the good guys still? And it's like,
Mm,
at some point you're not going to be the good guy anymore, but I mean, if you want to survive, does it even matter if you're the good guy in a
right.
world where no one's good?
Well, if so I mean, we'll obviously we'll talk about the road, but I think what's really interesting about, or one of the many interesting things about that story, they never get into like name territory. It's always just like the man and the boy, right? Um, if the man does not have the boy, does he have to carry the fire? Does he have to still try and be one of the good guys? It's almost as if the very fact that he has this kind of vulnerability is sort of, in a way, how he still has his strength to
It's like the
like to
kid just
carry on.
represents his humanity, because without the kid, he
Exactly,
doesn't have it anymore. What would be the
exactly,
point? He either tries to
exactly. He
survive or just gives up.
right, exactly, and I mean, I think one of the things. So did you see the movie version of it?
Yeah, I watched that like a couple years ago.
So I can't, because I was going to reread it before our discussion, but I haven't read The Road in a long time. But I'm pretty sure the character of the wife doesn't appear, or if she does appear, she's sort of very peripheral. Whereas in the movie, she's I mean, it's in flashback, but there are whole like long conversations and stuff, and she basically doesn't want to live, and he's constantly trying to convince her, like, listen, I know the world has ended, but we have a kid, and blah blah blah. And so I found that quite interesting how they kind of, in the movie, they make that explicit, which is she doesn't want to live anymore, and he's saying the boy, right? And then so
Yeah.
in the story, like you say, the boy is his whole reason.
I think
Um,
in the book it's more implied than it is shown. In the movie, they obviously
right,
have to speed it up, so she gives up. And just like The Last of Us, like one of the big things is life continues to go on, and
right.
how do you go on with it? So like that's the catalyst for The Road, of carrying the fire and just
Mm,
continuing your march forward, even though you don't really have to. Obviously, the
right,
wife didn't. She said, "Fuck it, why?"
right, right,
And that's the same questions The Last of Us asked. Do you need to continue? Should you
right,
continue? Why do you want to continue? And those are
right.
things that only the player can really ask themselves and come up with their own
Mm.
conclusions, because it's not really, given to you. There's no answers really
No, no.
given to you by the end of the game.
No, and I think that, like, that's why for me it's a superior story, is because it doesn't try and give you this 2D Hollywood bullshit ending where the good guys are good and the bad guys are bad, so, and we all go home. There's a point quite early on in the game where you go outside of the kind of quarantined town, and so Ellie for the first time is outside of the wall. So inside it's a kind of walled off city and there's electricity, and even though it's really dystopian and people are hungry and they're being summarily executed and stuff, it's still like humanity carries on in these little enclaves.
Mhm.
She goes outside where it's just the Wild West. There's no electricity, buildings are falling down, and the infected are just everywhere. And she says in the first moments of going outside, "Oh my god, I'm actually outside." After an hour or two, you're reaching a point where you're on a rooftop and there's this view of the Capitol building. And there's the kind of the dome is lit up kind of golden blue in the sunrise. And he says to her, Joel says to her, is it everything you hoped for? And she says, the jury is still out, but there's no denying the view though. And that's the heart of the game, right?
Mm.
Is it worth living? Is life good or bad? The jury is still out, but there's no denying the view. That's the entire philosophy right there, right? It's like, I don't know, is it bad? Is it good? But it's still a ride in the meantime, right? Which is kind of like you say, it lets you make up your own mind. If you Google The Last of Us decision, you're just going to get page after page of people being like, was Joel right or was he wrong, right? The very fact we're even talking about that,
Mhm.
has anybody asked whether Solid Snake did the right thing? And it's a different thing, right?
And it's kind of I didn't really think that hard about that scene, even though it's kind of a pivotal scene. But now that you're posing it that way, it's like remarkable that I mean, it's a suspension of disbelief thing because I don't know how old Ellie's supposed to be. I forget, but I'm thinking like 13 or 14 or something.
Yeah,
Um, it. Have you ever met a 13 or 14-year-old that would say something like that? No,
right,
probably. But in this world, maybe yes,
right,
maybe that's how it goes. Uh,
right.
so it's
Well,
kind
and
of
it depends where
fascinating.
you go, man, because you go to some countries,
Yeah,
like,
that's true.
we've spoken before. I've traveled a bunch. You go to some countries, and there are 14-year-olds and there are 14-year-olds, and depending on where you are, the expectations are different. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like even, and I'm not even talking about like in the middle of nowhere. Like even if you go to Tokyo, you're gonna see like a 9-year-old kid with fucking a massive school bag, and he's getting on 7 different trains to cross the city by himself to get to school.
Yeah.
In a way where our 9-year-old, I mean, maybe they do, but like you walk to school over the road
Mm,
or whatever. So it kind of it depends where you are. But clearly, she is very kind of bright and kind of precocious. I think she's 14. Um, but there is some suspension of disbelief with that because she's so insightful, and she so brave. I mean, that's one of her overriding features, is that she's just incredibly brave, right? Like
yeah.
there's a part where Joel is going to die and she has a way out, and then she jumps back down and she says we're in it together, stuff like that, where maybe a 13, 14-year-old kid would do that, but I fucking I wouldn't do that, so
Well,
um
life experiences shape us. So, I mean,
right,
if you look at, let's say, World War I, even World War II, there were 16-year-olds lying about their age to join the war. So
right,
obviously, their mind frame is a lot different than 16-year-olds now. So if you
right,
think of an apocalyptic world, we would probably revert back to a time where youth would have more responsibility and they would have to mature a lot faster. I think
right.
the maturation of kids now just really has to do with society. So, you
Mm,
got kids like you said, there's kids around the world. 14 is not the same as in the US or in
right.
England or wherever, because when you have things kind of easy and your
Mm,
biggest worries are I got to do homework, or oh, I watched this show and my fucking Netflix cut out, like, that's gonna be a lot different than the kid who has to go and work in a mine at 8 years old, or,
right,
a kid
right,
that doesn't have water and has to go get buckets of water from fucking 2
right,
miles away every day. Like, your experiences shape who you are, so I think that's
right.
I wouldn't find that, unbelievable personally. I think, uh I mean, I've met kids who've gone through things that had a lot deeper view of the world than, we give people credit for.
Right,
Mhm.
right. No, for sure. I think as well, like well, even if you just look at something of like what's the average life expectancy now when we're not top of the food chain anymore, right? So you can't wait to be a mature 25-year-old if you're going to live to 30 at best, so
Yeah.
um and we do see in the game that she is sent to, they do allude to it, and you see it later on in the Last of Us Left Behind, which is the kind of downloadable game, or the kind of well, not mini game, but it's not as long as the full thing, where it's like an Ellie flashback story. Basically, she
Mhm.
is sent to like a military school, right? And you see it in the series too. She is growing up. I mean, it's an orphanage, but it's a military school where they're being taught how to kill people from the word go, right? Because that's the world they live in. So it's not inconceivable that she would be um, already a little bit desensitized to this
Right.
type of violence, right? In the way that our kids would be.
Well, I think that shows up in, like, McCarthy's work, like, even just The Road.
Right.
The kid's obviously a lot more mature than he should be, but in that
Mm,
world, yeah, that makes sense. But if it was, a regular modern, US that didn't have a nuclear
mm.
fallout or whatever they're going against, it would be the kid probably just be a regular kid?
Right.
So,
Right.
that's, like, a theme that comes up in a lot of his work that I've read, where it's these young people who are much more mature because of their experiences.
For sure. Yeah, and I think that kind of gets to the heart of this story, where we talk about you know what do we choose to be in this dystopia. One of the questions that is being asked, or one of the kind of themes, is that kind of loss of innocence, right? Like when Joel loses his child, he loses his innocence, right? And his innocence, quote unquote, he loses his his kind of humanity.
Mhm.
And what Ellie is forcing him to do with her kind of innocent view of the world is to regain it. And that to him is terrifying, because if you love, then you lose, right? If you are vulnerable, then you get hurt. And that, to have a hero who is, a hero who is sort of both a brutal killing machine with no morals, but also kind of a vulnerable man who's getting old. It's really getting into and that leads into The Last of Us 2 without sort of any. Can I do the big spoiler on The Last of Us 2?
Go
Can
for it.
we?
I don't care.
So in The Last of Us 2, essentially, okay, so backtrack. The ending of The Last of Us 1 is that you're looking for a rebel group called the Fireflies, and they have control of this hospital in, I think it's Salt Lake City, and they have these specialist surgeons who are alive. And because Ellie has a mutation, which means that even though she's infected with this virus, she hasn't turned. She's the key to creating a vaccine. And the ending is Joel realizes that if they take Ellie as a kind of sample, because the fungus grows around the brainstem, she will die. So instead of letting that happen, he slaughters all of them. And the ending of the game is she wakes up from the drugs, and she says what happened, and he tells her some bullshit. And the ending of the game is she says, "Hey, wait!" And he turns around, and she says to him, "Swear to me that everything you told me is true." And there's this big kind of pregnant pause, and he says, "I swear." And the game ends there. The Last of Us Part 2 is that promise, right? That lie that he told. It
Mm.
basically gets explored. And the antagonist in the game is the daughter of the surgeon that you kill, right? So the surgeon who's going to operate on Ellie and create this vaccine, he's like a good man who's trying to save the world. Joel has just killed him in cold blood. So his kid grows up, and now she wants revenge, right? She kills Joel early on in the game. And in that kind of classic violence begets violence cycle, the point of The Last of Us 2 is that now Ellie wants to find this woman and to kill her and get revenge on her, and so on and so on and so forth, right? So it's a really kind of like bleak, kind of harsh game. But people, when they worked out that Joel was dead, and when they realized that like the two main characters were two women, it gets into the whole Gamergate thing. I mean, it's really stupid if you ask me. But they kicked off about it. They were not happy about it because now Joel was dead. But I do think there's a reason why people had that feeling of loss, and I don't think it's because Joel is a particularly good guy, but I think it's because he's a bad guy, but there is a good guy still inside him somewhere
Mm.
that's kind of
Mhm.
aching to get out, and that's the character work which I think is so masterfully done in this.
You know who encapsulates that character so well, and it came out before this game, was Woody Harrelson in Zombieland. It's the exact
Yeah.
arc.
Mm,
His
mm,
kid dies, but you don't know that his kid dies, and he's just this fucking relentless killing machine. Though he just kills
mm,
zombies, he's not killing innocent people. But he just goes through the whole movie where it's like it slowly unravels that, oh no, this guy has a reason for what he's doing and the way he
mm,
is. But you can see easily that's a comedy, but you can see easily how under more realistic
mm.
circumstances that guy would be like Joel.
Right, right. Yeah, and I mean it's funny because and we were talking about the Walking Dead earlier on. Funnily enough, the parts of the Walking Dead I like the most are. Did you ever play the Telltale video games of the Walking Dead?
I
I
haven't.
haven't.
So they're basically like it's basically like point and click games type thing, right? But it's like stuff happens and you have to make a decision in a certain amount of seconds, right? Do you decide to believe him, or do you decide to believe her, right? And then there's all these kind of like ripple effects about it. Um, and funnily enough, the main character in that is a teenage girl called Clementine, and an older guy has to look after her in the first game, and you kind of have to guide her through the wasteland. And you play the guy, I think he's called Lee, and then at the end of it, he dies. And then the second Walking Dead Telltale game is now you play Clementine, and you have to. Um, for me, that's like the best Walking Dead stuff I've ever seen, and it was a lot of fun because it was basically time decisions, right? Like you
Right.
you, you walk around and whatever else, but it's not like you're not shooting anyone or anything like that.
Mm.
But again, it's because it's character led, because it's character driven, because the whole game is if you make a decision, it pisses someone off or makes someone else happy. So you feel like you're making choices, but you don't know where those choices are going to end up, and that's like quite a rich experience to play.
Well, if I may, I'd like to zoom out a little bit and start to wrap up. But I just want to. There's two things. We talked a little bit about when Ellie finally gets like outside, and there was a point where it made me that when you said that it made me think of when you actually get to Pittsburgh, which to
Mm.
remind everyone, that's where Caleb and I are from. Um, and you're looking off into the city, and I was like, "Hey, this is outside for me." But literally the only identifying like Pittsburgh landmark is like the Highmark building, and then everything else looks nothing at all like Pittsburgh.
20
And if you
years was rough on Pittsburgh.
and if you follow our Instagram, I think I don't know if I posted it just in a story or an actual post, but I posted a picture of that just for laughs. Um,
To
but
be fair, all the
also
infrastructure is already crumbling, and that's with them trying to
it's
do maintenance.
true. um, but also, I guess I kind of wanted to end on just a little bit of speculation, like because they say that the infection starts because of a like fungus mutation, and they say it's
Mm.
a cordyceps mutation. So
Mm.
cordyceps is a fungus, basically like a mushroom. Um, and I thought like as I was reading that, if I played this in 2013, that would have been like a brand new word for me. But
Right.
this is kind of a funny thing, and it just makes me think like should we is it something like to think on, or is it hilarious because we literally make beverages now with cordyceps in them
Right. Right. Right.
and other foods like mushroom coffee and stuff like that.
Right.
And I was like, is that something we should be concerned about? Are we going to turn into zombies?
I
Well,
hope
I,
so.
I mean, I would be interested to hear what you guys think if you have a chance to watch the series, especially like the first couple of episodes, because they get into the outbreak, and in the game, you never really you know what it is, but they don't stop to explain how and why. And in the series, you have a bunch of kind of set pieces at the beginning of an episode where it's kind of unrelated to the main characters, but it'll be like a scientist talking about something in a lab. So that one is, I think it's like it's not patient zero, but it's one of the early bodies in the outbreak, or I think it's in Malaysia or Singapore. And the body has been brought back to a government lab, and so the scientist opens up the body, and then these kind of like fungal tendrils kind of come out, and she realizes like we're fucked, right? And they kind of basically explain the whole kind of genesis, where the infection begins, how it spreads, so on and so forth. What's really creepy about this is that the cordyceps virus is a real thing, that it does affect insects in the
Yeah.
Amazon and so on and so forth. There's a really good BBC, I think it's only like 3 or 4 minutes, but it's a segment from like BBC Planet, right, or Natural Planet or something, where it looks at the virus and how it affects spiders and ants and the rest of it. And it's fucking scary because it makes these creatures act against their own interests, right? Whilst the fungus is growing around its head and its brain, and then as it's getting ready to die, it climbs all the way up the tree, goes up to the highest point of the tree, so that when it bursts, the spores come out of its head and rain
Oh,
down into the jungle for as
Yeah,
much coverage as possible. You think
fucking gnarly.
oh my
it's gnarly. Like
god.
if that does
Metal
jump the
shit.
species barrier to us, we're fucked, man. Which is an interesting thing that they do play on with the series, where they get into it and stuff. So I would be interested to see what you guys think of. I'm sure you could probably find on YouTube. You don't even have to watch the actual like series itself, but just the couple of opening segments with scientists at the beginning talking about where has this come from and what are we going to do, especially the Singaporean one, because that one's great, just because I think it's a really interesting thing that kind of happens in parallel with the game which you've already consumed.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, with that explanation, sounds like a good choice for a plot device.
Yeah.
Because That's terrifying.
Yeah, it is. I think, but you see that's the thing where it's like the words we've used the word zombie a lot, right? But
Uh-huh.
you know, but it is a real virus, and I think what's creepy about The Last of Us is that the type of bad guy that you're dealing with depends on at what stage of the infection they're at. So when they've only been recently infected, they're basically still humans, but they're just not in control of their own minds anymore. So they're like bleeding from their eyes, but they can still see you and they run for you, right? And they go for you. But then when the infection has spread and developed, these kind of fungal plates, like these kind of mushrooms, have grown over their heads, so they can't. The eyes don't work anymore. So then they have to
Mhm.
click. So they make these clicking sounds to try and find you,
Yeah.
and they kind of get more and more fucked up. It's so beautifully designed. Like even looking at the in the extras of the game, where you look at the artwork and you see all these pictures, man. It's like I just think it's kind of a lot more interesting as like just like a horror story, like a horror movie. I think it's working at a higher level than like some actual horror movies I've spent money to see in the fucking movie theater.
Absolutely. All right. Well, this has been a delightful conversation. Like you can't anticipate. You can't really ask for a better conversation about a video game. There's probably more great conversations we could have with Nicolas Obregon in the future, but but this was really good. And I hope that Last of Us fans find this and enjoy it, because there's probably double the amount that we talked about to unpack from this game. It's just excellent.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, so I know Caleb's got some, he's short on time, so let's end this. So thank you,
Yes.
everybody, for listening to Arcade Bookshop. Thanks, Nick, for coming back.
Pleasure in endure and survive.
And stay tuned for next time, another episode of Arcade Bookshop. Nicolas Obregon will be back. We're going to be talking about Cormac McCarthy's The Road, to compare with The Last of Us, as you may have guessed from our conversation. If you've listened this far, let us know. Shout us out. Remember to rate us 5 stars if you haven't already, and you can follow us on Instagram at arcade_bookshop. Thank you all again for listening, and maybe do as we do. Keep a controller in one hand and a book in the other.